This is, without question, the greatest cookie that I've ever consumed. If you've been keeping up with my channel recently, you may have seen that I took a trip to New York City and I ate tons of food, some of the best of which came from Levain Bakery. They sell amazing, huge, 6-ounce domed cookies, and they're most famous for their chocolate chip walnut cookie. I couldn't get it out of my head, so I'm going to show you my homemade version for those that can't make that trip. I did kind of deliberately differ from the cookie that I tried in New York, but I think these changes are worth it and might make it a little better in my opinion. You're mainly going to see that I browned the butter, which I don't think Levain does. I also use a lot more chocolate, and I mean a lot more proportionally in my cookies than they do, but I just like my cookies that way. And I also toast my walnuts, which is a really minor change, but it definitely does make for a noticeable difference in flavor. But anyway, here's my recipe and process. I'm going to start by browning the butter so I can give it a chance to cool. I use this wide, shallow pan to brown butter because it goes a lot faster than a tall sauce pot, and I'm adding about 170 grams or a stick and a half of unsalted butter. Butter and chocolate are the two ingredients in cookies that I think the quality matters most, so when I feel like it, I usually use Kerrygold butter because it makes them taste that much better. Basically, just swirl that around over medium-low heat until you get brown butter. I usually stay on this lowish heat to keep things safe, and it takes me about 10 minutes. Once those bits on the bottom turn brown, that's how you know you have brown butter. It'll quickly turn into burnt or black butter, so be careful. I'm dumping this into a measuring cup, and then I'm going to replenish the water that evaporated with some heavy cream. I'd say about a tablespoon or 15 mils. I got that from Claire Saffitz, and I really liked how it worked in her cookies. So I'm just stirring that together and then tossing this into the fridge. If you can give it at least 30 minutes to cool down and start hardening up, that would be ideal. Also, what I want to do beforehand is toast my walnuts if you're wanting to do that. I just preheat my oven to 350F or 180C, and I evenly spread out 225 grams or 8 ounces of chopped walnuts onto a baking sheet. These should only take about 5 to 7 minutes. You should notice the toasted smell. And again, these can burn easily as well, so also be careful here. So a really important quality of these cookies is their domed and thick structure, as opposed to a thin cookie that just kind of spreads out, which is probably more common in most recipes. There's two main parts of this recipe that I include to make sure that we achieve that structural integrity, and the simple one is just refrigerating the dough overnight to make sure that the butter and everything else is solidified. But I also drastically cut down the sugar to flour ratio in this cookie. Most cookie recipes that I make have around a 1.5 to 1 or even higher sugar to flour ratio, and this one's going to have like a 0.75 to 1 ratio. That high sugar content in those other recipes is what helps them to spread out and become so thin. So by replacing some of that sugar with more flour, we're going to help our cookies to stay more upright. So into the bowl of a stand mixer, I'm going to add that cooled brown butter, along with 150 grams or 3/4 of a cup of light brown sugar, and 133 grams or 2/3 of a cup of white sugar. Using my paddle attachment, I'm just going to cream those together for a few seconds. You just want to try to get those sugars dissolved as best as possible. Then I'm going to add in 2 whole eggs and 2 egg yolks that I've already separated into a bowl. I do this 1 yolk at a time just to make sure that everything gets evenly incorporated. I beat all that together for another few seconds just until it's fluffy and ribbony. And by the way, Levain states that they don't use vanilla extract in their cookies, so I don't have it in this recipe, but if you want to add it, you can. I don't think it would hurt that much. But anyway, I'm going to finish with my dry ingredients. And for my flours, I'm using a mixture of cake flour and all-purpose flour. I think since these cookies are going to be so thick that the cake flour is going to help the texture a bit. So I'm doing 200 grams or 1 2/3 of a cup of all-purpose flour, and 160 grams or about 1.5 cups of cake flour. I'm also adding in 8 grams or about a tablespoon of cornstarch. That's also supposed to be a helpful ingredient when you're making thicker cookies. And finally, about a teaspoon of baking soda. I forgot to show this part, but I also added in 9 grams or a teaspoon and a half of kosher salt. Just be careful when mixing from here on out because you can easily overmix this dough. That's why I go on low speed and stop just as the flour is mixed in. And finally, the chocolate. Usually I add in chopped chocolate bars for my cookie recipes. I find that it's usually better quality and tastes better. But here I'm going to add in some chocolate chips because that's what Levain uses. To be fair, I am using the high quality stuff, the Ghirardelli chocolate. I'm using both the semi-sweet version and some of the dark 72% cacao version. They're definitely more expensive than the regular chocolate chips, but they make a huge flavor difference. I'm using a pound of chocolate in total, which is a lot for this amount of dough. And like I said before, it's a lot more than Levain uses, but I love chocolate in my chocolate chip cookies. I'm doing like 2 parts of the semi-sweet chocolate to 1 part of the extra dark chocolate, so that's about 300 grams of the semi-sweet and about 150 grams of the dark. And last but not least, don't forget about the toasted chopped walnuts from earlier. Again, just be careful in mixing this. The mixer tends to have to work really hard once you add these solid pieces in, but just keep it on low and keep an eye on it. It should only take a few seconds. If you go too far, the chocolate will start melting and streaking into the dough, which we don't want here. But that's our beautiful cookie dough. I'm going to toss this bowl immediately into the fridge to start letting it harden up a bit, only for about 30 minutes. That's going to allow us to form the dough balls a little easier. And if you want to get these as close as possible to Levain, you need to use a kitchen scale. They make it public knowledge that their cookies are 6 ounces each or 170 grams. So I just place the bowl on the scale and zero it out, and just use any type of scooping tool and remove the dough until it reads 170 grams on the scale. I sort of tightly pack that into a ball just so it stays together, and then put that on a wax paper lined baking sheet. Just repeat this process with the rest of the dough. You should get like 8 to 10 cookies out of this. Then I just wrap that in plastic wrap and stick it in the fridge. Some recipes say that you only need to rest this like 15 to 30 minutes in the fridge to let the butter set, but I always like to play it safe and do it overnight. That also helps the flavors develop a bit, and I think going like 2 days would be even better. And when it's time to bake, arrange no more than 4 cookies on each baking sheet. I've done cookies on foil, on parchment, on silicone mats, and on the baking sheet itself, and I really only get consistent results with using parchment paper. With the other methods, the cookies will either stick or they'll burn on the bottom before they're ready, so I always recommend parchment paper. So I had to play with the baking temp and time a little bit, but I think I figured it out. I did a test cookie which I used as my taste test, and you'll see that it's a little undercooked. That's because I baked it at 400 degrees Fahrenheit and the outside finished cooking before the inside could. So I recommend baking these at 350F or 180C, and it could take anywhere from like 15 to 20 minutes. I just rotate the trays and then shift their positions every few minutes just to make sure everything is even. And you're looking for a nice browning on the outside, but you don't want that to burn. And it's hard to tell the state of the inside of the cookie because you can't see it, but if you really want to be sure, you can use a thermometer. And I would just look to get the inside about 165 degrees Fahrenheit. But yeah, once they're done, let them cool on the trays for about 5 minutes before trying to remove them to a wire rack. And you really need to let these cool significantly before you try to break them because they are huge. And if you try to go in too early, they'll just kind of fall apart. But I get the allure of wanting to eat a warm chocolate chip cookie, so about 20 to 30 minutes should suffice. Like I said, the one that I'm going to try on camera was undercooked, but that doesn't matter. These still look amazing either way, and I'm ready to dig in, so let's go. You knew it was coming. Ignore the complete underdoneness of this thing, because I fixed that in the video, so just go by what I tell you. I'm only here to judge the flavor. That's why they call this a taste test and not a texture test. I wish I could do this side by side. I did take one of these cookies home, but I just wasn't able to get around to this fast enough before I ate that cookie. But it's only been a few days, so I still remember it pretty well. Let's see what this has to offer. I don't know what to say, that's pretty spot on. I know I probably tweaked this a bit with different things that I did, like toasting the walnuts for instance. They probably don't do that at the restaurant, but the balance of sweetness from the little amount of sugar compared to the flour and the semi-sweet chocolate with just a little bit of extra bitter chocolate, I think this really stands up to what I had in New York City. Yeah. And I'll say I was kind of skeptical about walnuts and cookies when I first went to try this, but believe me that in something like this, it makes it better. And I'm not really mad that this is undercooked. I might enjoy it better this way, but you do you. I think the ratios of ingredients put into this are pretty accurate and very important, not just for the flavor and the sweetness again, but also for the structural integrity of a domed cookie like this. I mean, I've made a lot of cookies at home. This is definitely the best one that I've ever made, but it's also maybe not as feasible for everyday uses. A huge recipe like this only nets 8 cookies. So if you're trying to make something for a crowd, this isn't probably your go-to. But I'm doing this on Labor Day, so I'm visiting my family later, and we don't have a big group of people, so it's going to be perfect. So if you don't have the opportunity to ever visit New York City and visit this wonderful bakery, then hopefully at least this recipe can kind of stand in the gap for you if you ever want to try it. I think it gets pretty close to the real thing. But let me know what you think. Thank you guys for watching. Be blessed, and I'll see y'all next time. You know it's real when you gotta whip out a spoon to finish the cookie.